The Memory of Love, Chapter 4. The talk of the town. I forget what brought me to pass by there a few years ago, but I found myself in the vicinity and wandered in through an unlocked door. It goes by some other name now, the fourth or fifth in however many years. I forgot exactly. The Ruby Rooms, the Ruby Lounge, otherwise nothing had changed. Inside, the same red carpet, marked with dark stains and chewed at the edges. In the half-light, the pock-marked velvet of the banquets, peeling fake wood surfaces of the tables, like one of the girls from outside the city hotel in the cold light of morning. The dance floor seemed ridiculously small and even empty. The place felt cramped. The air was foul, dense with the odor of sweat, sour beer and urinals. A piano stool stood alone on the platform, but no evidence of the piano. A man was stacking empty drink crates. He did not look up or take the trouble to greet me, sparing me the obligation of having to explain myself. Julius and Safia and Vanessa and I, 30 years ago. Together, we stepped through the door and onto the lush red carpet. Four old friends to anyone looking from the outside. The atmosphere redolent with cigarette smoke, the vapor of strong spirits. Julius, carrying his jacket over his shoulder, led the way. Safia and Vanessa followed close behind. I came last. I had heard of the talk of the town, though this was my first visit. Vanessa had been before, of course. Truth to tell, I preferred bars and visited them when I wanted to get out of my own space. Not to seek companionship, I preferred contemplation to conversation, and I had never liked, even feared a little, these kinds of public places. As I say, I cared little for music, and though I was a competent dancer, my talents in that direction had certainly never been remarked upon. Vanessa turned her head this way and that, trying to see who was there and also to reassure herself of the effect of her entrance. She wore a strapless yellow dress I had seen before, though on someone else. On her head she wore some kind of hair adornment held in place by pins stuck into her scarf. The whole arrangement was spiky and dangerous looking. As she swung her head around, it seemed at any moment as if Vanessa might catch a stranger's eye, though not perhaps in the way she imagined. Someone who knew Julius stopped him, and so I herded the two women onwards, looking out for a table. It was moments such as these I disliked about being out in public. Thankfully, Vanessa took charge of the moment, shooting ahead to where a group were just vacating a table. As they gathered themselves together, she slipped through the throng, slid her bottom along the banquet, and plopped her handbag on the table in front of her, like a trophy. I followed, stepping aside to allow Safia into the banquet, and then sat down opposite her on one of the stools. It was the first time I'd been able to look at Safia properly all evening. They had collected us in the variant, Safia switching places to sit next to Vanessa in the back, while I sat up front with Julius. Now she leaned forward onto the table, pausing to inspect the surface and wipe it with a spare serviette before resting her forearm on the surface. Her arms were bare. She wore a cream dress with a scooped neck, large black polka dots, caught at the waist with a black belt, a matching scarf draped behind her. I noticed such things. Most men don't, or so we maintain at any rate, for fear it will diminish us to admit it, I suppose. But more than that, I remember every moment of that evening. Next to Safia, Vanessa sat looking around. wearing a slightly silent expression she imagined passed for sophistication. Safia leaned forward and whispered something in Vanessa's ear. And judging by the smirk that appeared on Vanessa's face, I dare say Safia was congratulating her upon her wits in securing the table. We ordered drinks. Safia asked for a ginger ale. I urged her to accept a real drink. She shook her head. I told the man to bring her a rum and coke, whiskey for me. Safia requested a Guinness for Julius, who had yet to reappear. My back was to the room, to the dance floor. The room throbbed with sound, impossible to talk over the din. Safia, seemingly unconcerned, leaned forward smiling, watching the dancers behind my head. Presently, the waiter arrived with our drinks, something scarlet and sticky for Vanessa, imported and doubly expensive for it. I watched as Safia sipped her drink, bending her head to the glass. She leaned back, caught my eye and smiled. How is it? Yes, she nodded and began to hum, moving her head to the beat of the music. Julia says I have no head for drink. It's true, not like him. When we were students, I used to drive them all home at the end of the evening. I never really acquired a tolerance for it. Now I'm stuck with driving. At least, that is more or less what I think she said. What I caught were phrases punctuated by the buzz beat. You studied together? She nodded. Engineering? She cupped her hand around an ear for me to repeat myself. She laughed, leaning back into the seat. Shaking her head, I felt foolish. Botany, she said. Flowers? Well, plants really. Plant systems, soil, the sort of thing. Her eyes slid sideways again over my shoulder, watching the dancers, or looking for Julius. Her hands were clasped on the table in front of her, the fingers interlaced. With the nail of her forefinger, she began to trace an imaginary circle on the table. I looked at her and our eyes met. For the second time, I held her gaze as long as I dared. She smiled and looked back at me, and then looked away. For a moment, I was unable to breathe. I studied her profile and took a sip from my drink. From a different direction, I felt the heat of Vanessa's glare. I swiveled my stool around, showing her my back, and studied the people dancing. So, you see, moments later, when Julius joined us at the table, the current between us all were fractionally altered. Vanessa began to flirt with Julius, of course, touching his forearm, whispering in his ear, wriggling upon the banquet in time to the music. Julius responded after a fashion. The record changed. Julius and Safia stood up to dance, and I, following his lead, asked Vanessa. I accompanied this request with a show of courtesy, helping her out from behind the table, and this mollified her somewhat. We followed the other two onto the crowded floor. Later, we strolled onto the terrace, easing our way through tables of people taking a respite from the music, their faces glowing beneath the clarity of the moon. Julius seemed to recognize a good few people, or at any rate they knew him. He was the kind of person they called the life and soul of the party. Life and soul. Life and soul, without whom the rest of us collectively comprised nothing more than an inert corpse. Vanessa had found somebody, an age mate, a girl in a shiny black dress, and they were standing a distance away, whispering, shielding their lips from view behind the backs of their hands. Safia and I were alone. A blind man sat with his back against the wall, she said. Look at his smile. Why do you think he's smiling like that? The music, I replied. Yes, perhaps. We both watched the blind man. He sat, a great smile on his unperturbed face. He wasn't tapping his feet or marking the beat with his hand. He was just smiling. Safia said, But do you notice how often blind people smile or don't sometimes cry? I once saw a blind man in the street, the tears pouring down his face. He was quite alone. I thought about him for a long time. Perhaps it's a lack of self-consciousness, you know. They don't realize people are watching them. Does that make it better or worse? I can't help thinking it could only improve things if we all said and did exactly what we felt. I'm not sure, I said. Do you really believe that about the blind? Yes, I do. She watched the blind man, frowned slightly, and then added, and of course, he doesn't even know I'm looking at him now. Safia watched the blind man and I watched her. Dance with me, I said, because it was uppermost in my mind. I could think of nothing else until I had voiced that one thought. And so we danced. The way she danced with me, as though the act required concentration. Or perhaps it was just the rhythm. Perhaps it had gone to her head, though with the effect of forcing her to focus rather than relaxing her. Her hand on my shoulder, my hand at her waist. I had taken her to the taller. Between our bodies, a few inches of warm air. She kept her eyes averted from me. As we danced, I tried to inhabit the moment to remember it for later. I had it in my mind, and then it was gone. I walked her back out onto the terrace. There was Vanessa, mouth like a wet prawn, wearing an expression that made her face look as though the skin was stretched over a substructure of granite. Not a word all the way home. I remember Julia's passing silent comment, the way men do, a surreptitious slap on the back as we parted. He slipped into the passenger seat next to Safia, and as he did so, he waved his finger, grinned, raised an eyebrow, and shot a glance at Vanessa, and then back at me, as if to say, Elias, you old rascal.